Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a conflict that completely rewired the modern world. We are talking about World War I, the Great War. We're going to dive into how a single, isolated spark ignited an industrialized global catastrophe that dragged in over 30 nations and literally changed the course of human history forever. Let's jump right in.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to break this immensely complex conflict down into 5 chapters. The powder keg, the spark and chain reaction, a new era of warfare, shifting tides of war, and finally, the devastating global legacy.
Starting off with Chapter 1, the powder keg, decades of growing tension.
To really grasp how the entire world went to war in 1914, we have to look at the decades right before it. Europe was essentially a highly volatile tinderbox, and historians actually use a really helpful acronym to explain why. It's MAIN. First up, militarism. Empires were totally trapped in massive, costly arms races. Next, alliances, which were secretly binding countries together. Third is imperialism, an aggressive global scramble for colonies and resources. And finally, nationalism, these intense, fierce desires for ethnic independence, which was especially true in the Balkans.
Out of all those underlying tensions, 2 massive rival blocs emerged. On one side, you have the Allied powers, originally starting with France, Great Britain, and Russia. On the other side, the Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, the wild thing here is that these treaties were actually designed to deter war by promising mutual defense. But in reality, they created a massive tripwire. If just one nation fell into conflict, everybody else was getting pulled in with them.
That brings us to Chapter 2, the spark and chain reaction. The dominoes fall.
And man, did those dominoes fall fast. That theoretical tripwire became a tragic reality in just a few summer weeks. It all starts on June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo by guerrilla Princip. Exactly 1 month later, Austria-Hungary blames Serbia and officially declares war. Bam! The alliances activate. Russia mobilizes to help Serbia. Then Germany declares war on Russia, and then France. Britain jumps in right after Germany invades Belgium. In a matter of mere weeks, a localized dispute just completely spiraled into a total global meltdown.
Moving to Chapter 3, a new era of warfare. Industrial destruction.
You know, any romanticized ideas of patriotism that folks had in 1914 quickly crashed into the grim reality of modern combat. The Western Front became defined by hundreds of miles of trenches and just agonizing stalemates. And between those trenches lay no man's land. Trying to cross this muddy, rat-infested space during a frontal assault meant facing near certain death, often for absolutely zero territorial gain. So why exactly was no man's land so deadly? Well, tactics just hadn't caught up to the terrifying new industrial technology. Think about it. Infantry charges were suddenly facing machine guns that could fire hundreds of rounds a minute. You had heavy artillery, which, by the way, caused the vast majority of the war's casualties, obliterating positions from miles away. Add in the absolute horror of poison gas, the brand new British tanks, and German U-boats silently sinking ships from beneath the ocean, warfare was fundamentally forever changed.
But here's a crucial takeaway. This wasn't just happening on the battlefield. It was a total war. Entire societies had to be completely mobilized. Governments suddenly centralized their control over economies. They instituted food rationing and pumped out massive amounts of propaganda. Meanwhile, with the men fighting, women entered factories and government offices in unprecedented numbers just to keep their nations running. It was a massive societal shift that would permanently fuel global women's rights movements down the line.
60,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. That isn't the death toll for the whole war or even a whole battle. 60,000 represents the British casualties on just the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. It remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. And again, this was all for almost zero territorial gain.
Chapter 4, shifting tides of war. Breaking the stalemate.
After those horrific, bleeding stalemates in 1916, everything pivots in 1917. Facing utter economic collapse, the Russian Revolution overthrows the monarchy, and Russia eventually pulls out of the war entirely. But right as the Allies lose Russia, they gain the United States. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, plus a secret attempt to ally with Mexico, finally pulled America into the fray. Powered by fresh U.S. troops and resources, the Allies break the German lines, finally forcing an armistice on November 11, 1918.
Which brings us to Chapter 5, the devastating global legacy, the fallout.
The guns finally fell silent. but the world was just unrecognizable. 10 million. That is the approximate number of military deaths alone. When you add in the massive civilian casualties, over 20 million wounded, and millions more displaced, the sheer scale of the devastation is almost impossible to comprehend. An entire generation was deeply traumatized.
Beyond that staggering human toll, the geopolitical map was literally wiped clean. Centuries-old massive empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, simply vanished overnight. Out of their ashes, the map of Europe and the Middle East was completely redrawn, giving birth to brand new sovereign nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Finland.
So, how did the victors try to manage this new reality? Through the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. And wow, it was punishing. Through the infamous War Guilt Clause, Germany was forced to accept full, sole responsibility for the entire war. They were ordered to pay massive financial reparations, stripped of key land and overseas colonies, and their military was severely limited. For the German people, this was deeply humiliating, and it created massive economic and political instability in the years that followed.
Which brings us to this tragically ironic phrase that people used at the time, the war to end all wars. Folks truly hoped this unprecedented horror meant humanity would absolutely never allow it to happen again. But looking back at the economic ruin, the extremely punitive Treaty of Versailles, and a totally fractured global map, did this actually secure peace? Or did the unresolved grievances of World War I simply start a timer, paving the exact road for World War II just 2 short decades later? Something to think about as you reflect on the Great War. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.